Now, sometimes you might want, most of the time in functions, if you're following the do one thing well, most of the time the thing you pass back is a single thing. But there may also be circumstances where you write a function and you need it to return multiple values. Okay. Now there are basically two ways you can handle that. You can either return those values separately as separate outputs from the function, or you can, before you return them, you can put them into a single structure. So, for example, a list. So you could stuff them into a list and then pass back the list. So you're just passing back one thing, but it's a list that contains multiple values. Now, for the first approach, if you want to pass back the values separately, and you'll see examples of this throughout the course being used, what we do is we list out the values that are being returned using commas in the return statement, and when we expect them back the other side, we use commas for the variables that we want them assigned into. So let's have a look at an example to make that a bit more real. So here I've imported the random library simply because I'm going to use that in my function. But I've created a function here called generate 3 unique random integers. It's going to take 2 inputs that I'll refer to as low and high. Basically, all this function does, it first of all creates a variable called number1, randomly generates an integer between the low and high that were passed in. Then it has an infinite loop in a while loop, and it basically tries to pick another number between these ranges, and it will keep trying them until it finds one that doesn't match the first number, and then it does this again for the third number. So we'll end up with 3 unique random numbers. Now, what we do here, because we've got 3 things to pass back, I could pass them back as a list. I could put them in a list and then pass it back. You'll see that often in what you do. But there might be some reason I want those things to come back separately because I don't want them all together. So in this case, I'm going to return those 3 numbers separately. And so I use my return keyword in the same way I did before, and I simply list the outputs and I comma separate them. So we literally just list, I want to return number 1 and also number 2 and number 3. Okay, now that means that when we call the function, there will be 3 outputs passed back. So in this assignment here, it's no good just having one variable on the left-hand side of this statement, because there are 3 things that are going to be passed back. So we need to give 3 variables that will store these 3 things here. And so here I'm going to store them in some variables called num1, num2, and num3. And it's important to note it will store them in exactly the order in which it was returned. So this number that we refer to as number 1, the first one that gets generated, that will be the first thing that gets passed back, and that will be stored in this variable, whatever we call it. Similarly with number 2, that's the second one, that's this one up here. That will be stored in the second variable, whatever we call it, etc. So it will come back in that order. So bear that in mind. So here I call that function with the inputs 1 and 10. So it'll basically generate 3 random numbers, unique random numbers between 1 and 10. And you can see some outputs of how that would run. But as I said, you might want to return multiple values as a list instead. So here I've got exactly the same code in the main bulk of the function. The only difference is down here, where instead of returning 3 values separately, I've created a little list. I've just called it returned list. I've stuffed my numbers into there, and I simply then just return returned list. And because I'm only returning one thing, even though a list contains multiple values itself, then I only have to have one variable catching it on the other side.